So today we're going to be talking about continuous documentation and why the best time for that is now. But just before I begin, I'd like to get a bit of an idea where people come from. So is there anyone from the Nordics here? Oh, yes! Okay, so anyone from Finland? Oh, okay. I see one Dane, so is there any other person from Denmark? Okay, that's nice. Sweden? Norway? Ooh, Iceland maybe? No, okay. I guess there are a lot of people from Lithuania? Obviously. Okay, all right, let's get started. I do this because every time I go to a conference to speak, I happen to be the only Finn in the house. So the last time at the open source embedded conference in Lyon, I asked if there was any Finn, and apparently there was one person. It was Linus Torvalds. So it was really interesting for me. So I was hoping maybe. But yeah, okay, let's get started. Okay, so hello, terve. If you don't learn anything from this talk today, just learn that that's how we say hello in Finnish. At least that should be one take back home. Okay, so I'm Kenigbolo Meya Steven. My surname is somewhat difficult to pronounce, but it's very easy. Care, when you care for someone, and ni, your knee, and then when you blow someone, and then when you go low. So care, ni, bolo. That's basically how my name is pronounced. But of course, you can call me Meya and Steven, whichever one works for you. So I'm the front-end engineering lead at Bigcaster. Bigcaster is a media management company based out of Finland. I also work as a consultant. I'm the Archivary and community manager for the Coderfreak. Coderfreak is a weekend-intensive software engineering bootcamp, which we started in Estonia a couple of years ago, and now we have it fully online. What we try to do at Coderfreak is to give marginalized groups an opportunity to get into tech, because getting into tech is really difficult, and being someone who comes from a marginalized group, I knew the challenges I faced, and what we tried to do at Coderfreak is to make sure those who are coming after us don't need to go through the challenge that we went through. So you can find me on Twitter at ExpensiveStevie. If you're tempted to ask me about that handle, don't. Just an important caveat, on Twitter, I do not only post tech stuff, I post a lot of stuff about diversity in tech, getting more women into tech, getting more underrepresented folks into tech. I do have some hot takes, so if you're not comfortable with that kind of content, it's probably not a good idea to follow me, because I would keep shit posting those kind of things. Okay, and like I said, I work for Bigcaster, so let's get started. Before I begin the presentation, does anyone have any idea what continuous documentation actually means? Okay, this is a way better audience. I think the last time in Lyon, like 5 people already knew it, so it was a little bit tricky going through it. But who doesn't know what continuous integration means? Okay, so there's 2 hands. How about continuous deployment? No idea of what continuous deployment means. Okay, so this is then definitely going to be a good talk for both people without any idea of the continuous buzzwords and even experienced developers. So what I'll be talking about today: what is continuous documentation? Why is it important? The common pitfalls in current documentation practices, how to improve by implementing continuous documentation, and lastly, continuous documentation moving forward. So we'll be covering these topics as we go through this talk today. I know a lot of people will be interested in going to the break, so I will try to wrap up in about 45 minutes, and then we can have a question-answer session for the last 10-15 minutes. So what is continuous documentation? This is somewhat of a dictionary definition, but basically we refer to it as a pattern we've developed at Bigcaster, and it takes into consideration constant changes and improvement in code, and the important word after that is and business logic. to be reflected internally for every closed sprint. Like you have continuous integration and continuous deployment, one of the things we don't want to talk about, or we try not to talk about so much, is documentation. And the reason why engineers don't like to talk about documentation is because, sorry to say, most of the documentations out there are absolute crap. Which is why this was very important for us, because we had clients in Finland, which is called Yle. It's the Finnish Broadcasting Corporation. And if you know anything about Finland, you know that we have pretty high standards. So if you need to get government contracts or you need to have government projects, there are certain standards that you need to follow. And this was one of the reasons why we started with continuous documentation. So in our industry, change occurs so fast that sometimes it's difficult to catch all of it. It's the same case for documentation. Unfortunately, release notes don't cut it out alone. The amount of time we give to documentation in software engineering world is abysmal. And when I say abysmal, it's because documentation is thought about as an post-code activity, after code activity. This is how we as engineers are designed to function. And this is nobody's fault. I'm not saying this is a specific fault, because if you go to universities and you go to the way we are being taught in universities, during my master's, I'm pretty sure anything about documentation was basically the last part of any class you had. That's even if you had it. So we haven't given so much thought to that part. But what exactly is software engineering? Engineering as a discipline is about solving problems. And how do you solve problems? You create tools. You use tools to solve problems. But if you solve problems that you cannot communicate, what exactly is the point of the problem you're solving? As engineers, documentation is our communication tool. It's not just a communication tool for internal, it can be a communication tool for your internal developers because you can have internal documentation. But the moment you have a product that's client-facing, it becomes your communication, your primary communication tool with other engineers. This is why it's very important to pay as much attention to your documentation as you pay to your actual code. So in the open source world, we use requests for comments. Who doesn't know what requests for comments is? RFCs. Okay, so request for comment basically refers to, in the open source world, if we need to implement a new feature, for example, we put out the request for comment saying, okay, we have this new thing we want to do. If you're interested, or if you have some ideas, or if you think this is not a good idea, please let us know, regardless of what your comments are. This is used a lot in open source. This usually helps, especially if you want to go through a changelog that's usually very long or populated. You can easily go through the RFCs, but it's also not so easy. The problem with RFCs is that it turns out into a very long thread, and in the end, it's almost impossible to actually go through all of it. A typical example would be, does anybody work with Vue.js here? Okay, do you remember what happened with the composition API? Exactly. So when the RFC was first released for the composition API and some changes were actually asked for, there was a huge blowout. Now, I can't remember why the trouble started at first. I don't even know what the reason was. At that time I knew because I could read through. But if I go back to that thread today, I can't really tell what the idea behind it was. So RFCs are very good, but they're not as equipped as you would want for a source of reference. So internally, except you work in enterprise projects, you probably don't use RFCs. RFCs are more popular with enterprise projects and with the open source projects. The problem comes with change. Every documentation problem that you would face today or when you go back to work would come with one change. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a change you make. It could be a change someone else makes. And then another change. And then even more changes. And this is where it starts to get out of line. You find a situation where your knowledge base is totally out of sync with your code base. So if you work in cross-functional projects, you find a situation where on one part, someone makes a change, it's pushed, and it's like, okay, there's no documentation change, there's no explanation. I think the most accurate word for it is hotfix. We make a hotfix, and then someone else makes a hotfix, and before you know it, you've got 20 hotfixes. The business logic, when you wrote that documentation, has actually changed from the logic in the code. What you're actually selling to people is not necessarily how it works behind the hood anymore. You have a dysfunctional code base. Now, the problem comes when you have young engineers, you have beginners. We, as experienced engineers, sometimes we don't care. My job involves a lot of mentoring, so I see this almost every day. When you have beginners, they come into this code base, they go through the internal documentation, but it doesn't match with what they see in the code. It's totally different. Now, why is it important? Why is the continuous documentation practice very important? This is a quote. This is a quote I made during a workshop I was giving to a company in the Netherlands, and I said the reasoning behind the change you fail to document today might forever become lost. It's going to result in a knowledge base gap. What you end up having is an unsynchronized knowledge base. I didn't even know I made this quote until someone quoted it for me on Twitter and said, you said this at our company. So at the time I was making an explanation, but I always try to use this and I always keep it because I think it's important. So have this at the back of your mind, or in front if you need to. When you make a change, a feature change, oh, it's just a small feature. That's right. You don't document that change. You go on to introduce another small feature and another hotfix. What you find out is, at that point, when you try to actually update your docs, it becomes very difficult. Because you might not remember the reason why you made the change. Now, I know a lot of people would say good commit messages could help. Yes, they could. But how many people actually write good commit messages? That's the thing. Okay, so we've got one person there. Woo! Rounds of applause for him, please. So a lot of our commit messages are, I think there's a Twitter handle dedicated to that. If you see the kind of commit messages that we write sometimes, you know they're not helpful. If your commit messages are good, yes, you could actually use that as a reference. But imagine if you have to do 3 merges. For example, you merge from one branch to another branch to another branch, and maybe something changes in between those merges. Still, in those cases, the commit messages do not really help you in that sense, because it could be a word change. So in my commit message, I would say change the word from simply to simple, but that word change might actually have changed the entire meaning of the sentence. So my 2 commit messages in this sense do not necessarily help me. Having an unsynchronized knowledge base is a problem for you, for your company, and for the engineers that will actually inherit that code. Because remember, every code you write today is going to be legacy code tomorrow. Someone is probably going to have to maintain it. So let's look at the typical documentation types. Proprietary software, docs included and maintained. I think this you get with bigger projects, enterprise level projects. I think these are the documentations that are probably the most up to date, because a lot of the times they have SLAs, and if your documentation tells me something different from what you're actually doing, and I follow that, and I end up having time wasted or I lose money, then you basically owe me some money. So with the enterprise products and projects, they are very careful. They spend a lot of time in the documentation. Now, with this type of projects, what you usually see is there is a dedicated documentation team. Does anyone here work in enterprise projects? Okay, do you have a dedicated documentation team? No. Interesting. What project do you work on?
I work on some engineering software for structural
Engineering. Okay, nice. So that's very interesting, because all the enterprise projects I've seen actually come with a dedicated documentation team. But this is actually interesting. So who writes the documentation?
There are a few levels of documentation. There's some documentation for the users, which gets written by the technical writers. So
okay, so you have technical writers writing.
Yeah, so the development documentation, most of the APIs are
documented. Okay, yeah. Okay, so your external documentation, you have a technical writing team that does that. Okay, yeah, that's exactly what I was just talking about. All right. Now, popular frameworks, sometimes they have dedicated teams, sometimes they don't. So I happen to work with a lot of front-end frameworks, but mostly between Ember.js, Vue.js, and React.js. And I always give the shout out to Vue, because Vue.js probably has one of the most amazing documentation ever. You don't need to know about Vue, you just need to go to the docs and you can get started. That's how good the docs are. Ember.js also has quite good documentation, and they have tried over time to improve it. React.js, we don't really have an official documentation. We have documentations, right? But it's not like a real hub per se. So everyone gets information from different places, and that's because React is unopinionated. So this is also another type you would see, and you see this a lot, especially with open source. However, for smaller open source projects, you would usually see just one single person writing the documentation. Now, at your company, I'm guessing developers write the documentation. Developers write both internal and external. At most companies, developers write both internal and external documentation. If your company has a dedicated team that writes documentation apart from enterprise, can you just raise your hand? If developers write documentation, can you raise your hand? So, okay, so the rest people, I guess you don't write documentation at all. All right, so we have something very similar. Because we're not big, we do not have a dedicated documentation team, but we have had some practical steps in which we try to mitigate this, and I will be sharing those steps with you as well. So what we do with documentation is that we have one technical writer, and then we have developers collaborate with that person. And after the documentation is actually made, we take it to a non-technical person. And then we say, hey, can you read through this and tell us if you understand what we're saying? If the person doesn't understand what we're saying, then we go back and then we make a revision. The idea is to make the documentation as simple as possible, that even non-technical people can actually look at it and say, okay, so this is going to do that and that is going to do that. What they wouldn't know is how to implement it, but they would understand it. The language matters. So if you write your docs, there's always one person in your company that's not technical. Someone has to do the business. Take it to a business person, get them to go through it, and they should tell you honestly if they understand it. A lot of the times, because we try to patronize each other, they go through, I'm like, yeah, this looks really good, but ask them for honest feedback. And you might actually see that you probably are just writing a lot of geeky stuff that might not make sense to a lot of people, not even non-technical people. So always have that at the back of your mind. And this is the process that we use. This works for us, and I hope that this can also work for you if you're a small team. So the common pitfalls in current documentation practices, if you just said to yourself, you're doing it right, then trust me, you're actually doing it wrong. Every time I do consultancy workshops, the first thing I ask is, how good do you think your documentation is? And everyone goes, oh, yeah, it's quite good. I would rate it like 80, 85%. And when we're done with the workshop, everyone goes, okay, this is more like 35%. So if you just said to yourself, internally, oh, we've got really good documentation, maybe you should wait and let's go through this again. So this is it. Yep. That last minute, when we should actually make an awesome submission, we should actually make an awesome documentation, we always miss it. And why do we miss it? It's because we always think about documentation as a post-coding activity. How many people have actually sat down to review documentation? Okay, so there are a few hands. Now, we've implemented something we call, you always have your code reviews. Now we have something we call documentation review. If you make a change that affects business logic and affects how a client is going to deal, you basically update the documentation. Now we're not talking about your APIs. We're basically talking about, in terms of SDKs and projects that you ship out, for example, you always document those changes. And before that feature goes into production, basically there's a check that says, has the documentation been updated or attached, or this does not need a documentation update? If that part isn't checked, it doesn't ship. And that's why we try as much as possible to avoid this. By the way, I'm a Chelsea fan. I hope there are no Spanish people here. Oh, good. So that was Fernando Torres, and this was against Manchester United. The biggest miss, I think, of his career. Hopefully no one makes those mistakes anymore. Okay, so let's look at simple things you're probably doing wrong. And take note of that first word, simple. Simple things. Perception. READMEs. How many people have the documentation in READMEs? Okay. You're actually doing it wrong. So, if majority of your code documentations are actually inside readme.md documents, then you have been doing a lot of disservice to what documentation is. Now, I'm telling you this from a good place. If you have people come to your docs and they go through, they see a long README file, after the third section, they don't want to read anymore. They just don't want to do that. So how you mitigate this is having a docs folder, changing your READMEs into sections, and referencing those sections from an external doc.md. Another way you can mitigate this is to have sections at the top. So every time you write the documentation, you have a table of content. So if I need to find something, I can easily go and click on the link of, for example, getting started or setting up. I don't know what's wrong with this mic. Maybe I should put my glasses on them. But every time I want to find something, I don't want to have to skim through the entire thing and go to the bottom of the page in order to actually find what I want. I want to be able to just look for it, see a header or a link, and then get the information I want. This improves user experience. It makes it easy for people to actually digest your documentation as well. This is also super important. So if you're having a lot of stuff there, what you have is clutter. It's not really documentation. Try as much as you can to put those information into smaller segments, into smaller sections, and into other MD documents. Now, something common that people do not know about Markdown format is you can actually link other documents from Markdown. You can link to another folder and another specific document, and when someone clicks on that link, that folder is actually going to be opened. This is a possibility you can use, so try as much as you can to use it. You can use READMEs, but they should be an entry point. README should be an entry point to your documentation, not your actual documentation itself. Unhelpful phrasing. How many people could actually see the P there? Exactly. Who uses a word checker for their documentation? Okay, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. All right. There are a lot of words that you use that you might assume are okay. However, they're not. And this is because when you write documentation, you're writing it to yourself and you're reading it to yourself, and it's okay to you. However, software engineering is a very diverse industry. You can't assume that what's okay for you is actually okay for the next person. This is why you need word checkers. It's very important. There are a lot of minor things that word checkers could actually help you catch. So try as much as possible to actually use this if you don't currently do that. Inconsiderate writing. Now, before I go into that, I'm going to highlight a few unhelpful phrases, and I'm going to talk about inconsiderate writing as well in the next section. But can you take your documentation, give to a non-technical person, and expect them to make any sense of it? If you can't do that, I understand that the go-to excuse we usually use here is, of course it's a technical documentation. And I agree. It is a technical documentation, but it's also a means of communication. Communication is a two-way street. If you're saying something and the other person isn't understanding, technical or not, you're not actually communicating. You're just blabbing in that sense. Documentation is a form of communication. So if no one actually understands your documentation apart from you and 2 other engineers that you work with, you probably are doing something wrong. You need to take a step back, and try to find ways to actually mitigate that. So let's look at READMEs. They're supposed to be an entry point to your documentation as opposed to being your main documentation, like I highlighted. You can use other sections. You can basically make a table of content. Try as much as you can to make your documentation as lightweight as possible. Now, one of the reasons why I put this here and why I feel it's important is also because when you have beginners, new engineers, I focus a lot on teaching people. So it's one of the things I hear, one of the feedback I get a lot. The documentation is too packed. I get lost while going through it. Try to help people. Not everyone is going to be at the same level of understanding as you are. So try to make your documentation as modular as possible. If you're having more than 3 sections, that directly signifies there's too much information that needs to be somewhere else. Segment it, put it somewhere else. Put it in the new file, put it in a new folder, and just link to it. But make sure you try to keep it to 3 sections. Now what I do is I try to keep the getting started, installation instructions, and examples. Every other thing comes as a link, a subsection. You can find, but this is not a strong recommendation. Depending on the kind of documentation you write, you can find the 3 most important sections that people need to actually get up and running. And then every other thing can actually go into an extended folder. Ever heard of clutter? Yes, that's exactly what too much stuff in your README is. If you put too many things in your READMEs, it's clutter. It's not really documentation because you lose the value of communication. You're not actually communicating. Maybe to you and a few other people, yes, but to a larger audience, probably not. So yeah, when you go back to work, you can do just that. At least you tried, you gave it a shot, but take that documentation, split it into smaller segments, into smaller sections, and make it more user-friendly, more beginner-friendly as well. So let's look at unhelpful phrasing. Now, a lot of the things you will see here might be true. A lot of the things might not necessarily apply to you, but I can guarantee that you would probably resonate with a lot of them. So, simply run the tests. Who hasn't seen this before? Good. Do you actually think this is really informative? Okay. Now, the problem with this is that you are assuming that the person who is going through the documentation actually knows how to run the tests. When you say simply run the tests, it's like, okay, if I go to a new project, of course, I probably would understand how to simply run the test. If someone else who is getting into tech, getting into programming, do they really understand how that works when you use the word simply? Just write the compiler, then it simply works. If you walk around in the Golang community, you would see this a lot, because I have written this before myself. And sometimes it comes from a place of good intent. However, this is not helpful. This doesn't help you, it doesn't help me, it doesn't help the person reading the documentation. If you use this kind of phrases, this kind of sentences, try to avoid it. So when you write something, take a step back and look at what you've written and ask yourself, if I didn't know anything, how would this sound to me? Would I resonate with this? Simply, just, simple, actually, easy, easily, obviously. I can go on and on and on. There are tons of these words. What these words do is they assume the intellectual capacity of the person reading the documentation. It might not affect you because you might have a good self-esteem, and that's okay. If I'm getting into tech, I have, for example, an imposter syndrome, and then I go and I see something like, oh, easily do this and that, and it should work. And I go and do this and that, and it doesn't work. I start feeling incompetent. And you have indirectly made me feel incompetent, just because you have used these words. You have said easily, so I have assumed that it's supposed to be easy. When it doesn't become easy for me, then I feel like I'm not competent enough. This actually doesn't help me, it doesn't help you, it doesn't help anyone. So if you go back, you have some of these words, some of these phrases in your docs, try to change them. They are way better alternatives, I can assure you. So let's look at inconsiderate writing. Now, the thing with inconsiderate writing is that it's very generational. Some of the things I would highlight here have been in vogue even before I was born. And I'm 30, so imagine something that has been going on for over 30 years. They're generational, they're cultural, they've been there. It's difficult to change, but it's up to us, more than software engineers, to actually make those changes. So I'm going to implore you, wherever you see these phrases, call them out, correct them, make a pull request to change them. It's actually very important. There are a bunch of them. I'm just going to highlight a few. If you want to find out more about this, we can talk about them later on as well. I'm just going to highlight a few here that I believe are informative and can give you an idea of phrases that do not help. So let's look at the first one. Gender favoring. Hey guys, he, his, dude. There's tons of them. Especially you see this in RFCs. When you go on GitHub, if you don't go to my profile, you don't know if I'm male or female because I just use an avatar, right? When you say, hey guys, you're in an RFC, for example, you're basically assuming that everyone is a man. And that's just not right. A lot of us don't actually realize this. We do it subconsciously. We don't even know when we do it, but the way you fix this is whenever you see it, you try to consciously tell yourself that maybe this is wrong. Maybe I shouldn't be using gender-favoring phrases. There are a lot of different ways. And just to take this out of documentation, also in your internal companies, your internal communication tools, let's forget documentation just for a second. On Slack, for example, don't use phrases like this. When communicating with people, in a community, don't use this. It doesn't help anybody. There are better ways. You can say, hey folks, hey people, hi everyone, but try not to use this kind of gender-favoring phrases. They don't help anyone in the industry, trust me. Avoid race-related phrases. This is a tricky one, but I will highlight this later on. And just to give a typical example, one of the reasons why I started spending a lot of time doing research into documentation and how to improve documentation practices was because of one of my Danish friends, Kenneth Larsen. So Kenneth wrote a post for Ember.js, and he said, make Ember great again. Now, in Europe, this is okay. Like, we will joke about stuff like this, of course. In the US, make anything great again is a little bit different. How people see it, how people perceive it is very different. Now, it was a honest Nordic joke, like, come on, Trump wanted to buy Greenland, right? So it was all a joke, but people would actually take offense to things like that. So you need to be very careful. I will try to highlight at least one more later on, but try to avoid those kind of things. Sometimes they're honest mistakes, but they do not really help anyone. Polarizing or unequal phrases. It has always been like that. Senior engineers, we do this a lot. I have been guilty. I'm pretty sure a lot of us have been guilty. This is no explanation. This is not how you write something in your RFC. This is not how you explain in a request for comment. It has always been like that. What does this tell me? Does this tell you anything? It doesn't tell anybody anything. It has always been like that. It's very polarizing in my opinion. So if you find something to say, try to say something else. And I know that there's always that one guy in every company that actually says this. Try not to put this out. It doesn't help anyone. So, how to improve via continuous documentation? Preconceptions are pure evil. If you think that something is good, it's sometimes quite okay to double check. Always remember that documentation is a form of communication. Communication is a two-way street. If a documentation is ambiguous, you have actually failed to communicate. And if you fail to communicate, you have failed in what the documentation is actually supposed to do. So please always have this at the back of your mind, or in front, if you wish. It's a two-way street. Try as much as you can to communicate your ideas in simple and understandable language. So our process is easy. Make changes, document changes, you screen the updated docs. So this basically works. When a change is made, you need to document that change that you have made. And like I mentioned, before it goes to production, we need to screen if the docs have actually been updated to match the change. So, readmes. First, ensure that your document is in Markdown format. Now, you can use .txt, and that's okay. You can also use HTML, that's fine. But I think that Markdown has basically become a de facto standard in writing docs. So I would advise that if you can, you possibly should use this. Badges are very good. They're very informative, especially in open source. So put those badges there. All the CI badges, all the code factor, whatever it is. Put those badges there. It gives people a better understanding. And this specifically refers to open source projects. So those CI badges are quite good. It makes me know that this library is maintained. This test is basically running and passing, and I don't have to worry so much about that. Like I also mentioned, create a separate folder for docs in every repository. When you have a repo, and this is specifically for your internal docs, this can also go for external, but for every repository you have, or if you use a monorepo, for example, every individual repository in your monorepo, you should have a docs folder that basically explains stuff, if need be. Also keep that. I think it's very important, and this could help you a lot. Your README should contain simply the description, getting started instructions. Every other detail should move to a respective Markdown document or a respective section. However, if it's small enough, you can put all of them in your READMEs and just have a table of content. If it's a lot of stuff that will basically take over 1,000 lines, probably you want to move that to another document. So, unhelpful phrasing. Documentations are tools for communications as opposed to a place to expand your ego. Do not assume that everyone is on the same skill level as you are. So now I'm basically reiterating the same things I've said, and I'm doing this because I want it to stick. Call a non-technical person or content writer to help you review your documentation. Like pair programming. A second pair of eyes is always good. 2 heads are better than 1. Maybe 2 good heads, yes, but it's always good to have someone else go through these docs with you. Review documentation changes just as rigorously as you review your code. It is equally as important. The idea that code is more important than documentation is absolute software engineering fallacy. It's just not true. Your documentation is just as important as the code that you write. Documentation is not a second fiddle in software engineering. It's also a first class, just like your code. So please always rigorously review your docs the same way you rigorously review code. And I'm saying this because there are some code reviews you see that people go and start. They're reviewing things that are not, in my opinion, super important. Like, yeah, this shouldn't be this way, this should be that way. Does this work? Yes. Why do you think it should be that way? There's no explanation. It's just your opinion, your ego. Things should be done your way and not the other way around. That happens in pull requests a lot. Now, if we could transfer that same energy, the good part, not the bad part, obviously, to our documentations, we could actually start having really good documentations out there. So, inconsiderate writing. This is the interesting part, and this is where I want to actually highlight some things I think are very historical that we probably, before today, you didn't think about, but hopefully this will make you think about them. Don't you think primary replica sounds better than master-slave? We use this a lot in DevOps, software reliability engineering. This is quite common, master-slave. Do you think this phrase actually passes a message? Do you think master-slave is better than using primary and replica? Doesn't primary replica sound more English-like than master-slave? Now, master-slave has been in existence even before I was born. This has been going on for like ever. It's cultural. It's a de facto. It's something we always use. But as modern engineers, we need to consciously change those tones. We need to change those language. We need to change the inconsiderate writing. So when you see this, point it out. Tell people like, master-slave doesn't resonate. It doesn't really pass a message. There are better ways to actually explain this. Now let's look at another one. How about we use allow list / deny list instead of whitelist, blacklist? Again, this is something that has been going on even before I was born. It's cultural. It's been there. But does this really help? No. If you're basically playing on racial bias here. That's exactly what you're doing. You're saying white is better than black. That's what this highlights. That's exactly what this says. White is better than black. Whereas what we are saying, or what we are trying to communicate is, oh, allow this list of IPs, allow this list of domains, deny this list of IPs, deny this list of domains. But no, we just have to play on racial bias. It's been going on. Our industry was built on things like this. We need to consciously change this narrative. So I'm pretty sure that you have seen this somewhere, and what I challenge you to do today is, when you see this somewhere, highlight it and make them understand that this is not okay, this is not cool, this plays on racial bias. There are better ways to actually pass your opinion or your idea than doing this. This is where you get the terms, it has always been like that. Yes, it has always been like that. Doesn't mean it has to continue being like that. We should bring change to the industry. Change, in this point, starts with our documentation. Doesn't "hey everyone" sounds more gender neutral than "hey guys"? We say "hey guys" a lot, even despite the fact I'm here giving this. Sometimes I want to write and I go "hey guys" and I'm like, no. Push the delete button and change it to "hey everyone." Why? It's because I was brought into the industry with this kind of language. This is how it's always been working. And I have to make the conscious decision to tell myself that this is not okay and I should do better. So I implore all of you and I charge all of you to try to do better with the documentation. Now, I'm not going to go on and, I'm pretty sure that you probably are thinking about a few other things that you have seen in documentations or seen somewhere else that probably could change. And I'm hoping that as you go back, you could actually spend some time, and when you see those things, consciously tell people. Now, I'm not saying to just change it. Make people understand why it needs to be changed. Because when you say, oh, change this to that, without giving them an explanation, making them know that this is the reason why you shouldn't be using this, it might just be, to them, it might just be you throwing your weight around. So make them understand why it's important to actually change and use things that are more modern instead of sticking to cultures that are harmful and abusive. So, just to conclude, release notes are nice. You should have release notes. They're very important. So, irrespective of your company size, doesn't matter if you're 5 or 10 or 15 people, please always have release notes. Even if you don't use semantic versioning, always have release notes. When you ship something new, let it be documented somewhere. So that, and the reason is, I think every engineer at some point in your career, you have been at that position where you start thinking like, why did we actually do that? And you can't remember why a certain decision was made because it wasn't documented anywhere. It's like, oh, the business people said this and then we changed. But if the person who actually made that decision and the people who made the change leave the company, there's a knowledge gap. It's lost. It's not there. A typical example would be if you go, I'm not sure how many people work with React, but if you use Redux, for example, there are a lot of things, a lot of thoughts regarding Redux when it was first released that are actually lost now. Some of the times you look through some things and you're like, why did we actually change from doing this to that? And you can't find that information anywhere. So it's important that you have these release notes. Of course, there are release notes. Some release notes are not as well documented as others. So try as much as you can to use this to actually keep a log of what you do. Now, there is no such thing like too much of good documentation. They usually say too much of everything is bad. Too much of good documentation is never bad. It's always good. It's always better. So there's no such thing as too good documentation. If there's a reasonable change somewhere, there should be a corresponding documentation update. And that update should reflect the change that you have made. So, auto-generating documentation from code, while being a good thing, most times results in common mistakes. Things can fly, below the radar. There are a lot of things when you use auto-doc generation. There are a lot of things that you might miss. I know this because, okay, I can't. It's kind of an internal stuff, so I can't really share here. But We have had some considerable weird stuff going on when we generated our docs. So now what we do is we always generate the docs, but we don't just leave it like, oh, it's been generated and this is what. No, we basically go back and review, because if you recall, if you know very well, that generated documentation is basically still you. You write that thing that's actually generated. So if, for example, I have on every API endpoint, I basically have this short block that says, oh, API key, this is needed for that, API secret, this is needed. When my documentation is generated, this is what actually comes. It's still that same thing as I have written. It's just generated to a specific format. So do not just avoid, oh, this is auto-generated. Yes, it's auto-generated. There are other things that are added, but try as much as you can to also review it, because a lot of things might just, go through and slip into production if you believe that everything that's auto-generated is actually good. So moving forward, continuous documentation is all about continuous improvement to your documentation practices. So unlike what I said at the beginning, there is no hard rule for this. The rule, and the only rule, is that when you make a change, you update your documentation to correspond to that change. The goal of continuous documentation, and what we have tried to do at Bcaster and what we are trying to bring to different companies, is to make them understand that your code base is just as important as your documentation. And at every point, you should try as much as you can to keep them synchronized. Now, currently, we're working on a documentation spec that enforces certain standards but are flexible enough to be configurable. We're also currently working on a linting tool using those standards. We've called it doclint. The idea is that it's going to be to documentation as ESLint is to JavaScript. Now, this tool is actually going to be an open source tool. We're currently working on it. I'm going to be hacking it today a little bit. So if anyone is interested, please, someone should be interested, to help out, this will be great. And the reason why I want help and why I'm looking for help is because in open source, it's usually the case where one person writes an open source tool, and then later on, a lot of people come on board. I want to try to change that narrative. I want it to be a community tool that's continuously improved by the community. And that's the reason why I have hesitated in moving it forward to a large extent. So I'm currently working on this alone. This is my company's contribution to open source. I'm the sacrificial lamb. And this is what I'm working on this tool at the moment. So if you are interested in how this tool works, it's still at beginner stage. It can move, well, the structure is out and quite flexible, so it can move from, it can basically be in beta in a day or two as well. So if you're interested in hacking this, if you know anything about anything, right? I don't want to say if you know about this or that. If you know anything about anything, I will be more than interested to talk to you. You can write me on Twitter, and I will just add you to a small, it's not going to be a Slack or anything, just a small Gitter that we can discuss and share ideas, and I can explain how far we've gone with this. So please, if anyone is interested, just meet me after now or write me on Twitter. Let's try to collaborate, and let's try to improve documentations. So the targets for doclint. We want to build a JavaScript package because JS is a very popular language and a lot of people use it. So we basically want it to be a JS package that's basically embedded, just as you have ESLint. We also want to extend it to the Rust CLI. Basically, this is to enable anyone use it anywhere if they have as a command line tool. I just started off with the Rust package. I'm not very good at Rust, so I'm still exploring it. This is still at early stages, so I would pretty much like some help if someone who knows Rust. And then we want to target browsers, basically a browser extension also. So the idea is that nobody has an excuse not to actually use it. So we are going to be responsible for making documentation better. If you're interested in helping out, let's have a chat, let's brainstorm. We've created an internal TC at Bcaster, and we'll be happy to share ideas with everyone and get feedback, and let's try to build this. So that's all for today. Thank you.
Kiitos.